Good morning and welcome to the 7th meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2021. Agenda item 1 is decision on taking business in private. I'm going to assume that everyone agrees unless a member indicates otherwise. So does any member object to taking items 4, 5, 6 and 7 in private this morning? Please say, rather than raise your hand because I can't see you, please say if you do. Okay, thank you. Members have agreed to take items 4, 5, 6 and 7 in private. Agenda item 2 is major capital projects. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the meeting this morning. From the Scottish Government, Alison Stafford, Director General of the Scottish Exchequer, Gary Gillespie, Chief Economist, Rachel Guillaume, Deputy Director, Infrastructure and Investment, and Alan Morrison, Deputy Director, Health Infrastructure, all from the Scottish Government. From Transport Scotland, we have Bill Reeve, who is Director of Rail, and from the Scottish Futures Trust, we have Kerry Alexander, Director of Infrastructure, Finance and Programmes, and Gemma Boggs, Senior Associate Director, Social Infrastructure, and they are both from the Scottish Futures Trust. I understand that Alison Stafford will be making a brief opening statement. Alison, I invite you to do so now, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. I'm pleased to assist the committee today with your scrutiny of our most recent 6-month report on major capital projects that have a positive impact on the places where we live, how we travel, and how many of our vital public services are delivered to communities across Scotland, not to mention our economy. I make just a few opening comments. Let me start with the panel. As the convener has just introduced, I am joined by a number of subject matter experts from Transport Scotland, the Scottish Futures Trust, the Scottish Government's Chief Economist, and other Scottish Government colleagues from the Health Finance Directorate and the Infrastructure Investment Team. Should committee members have questions about projects or issues in these areas of knowledge, my colleagues and I will be very happy to respond. If there are questions about projects or programmes in sectors not represented by the panel, we will provide as much information as we can today, and of course offer to follow up in correspondence at any more detailed points with those who are directly accountable for those projects and programmes. Your session today takes place at a key time and pivotal moment. We're nearing the end of the current 2015 Infrastructure Investment Plan, so there's an opportunity to reflect on a range of investments that have taken place. Much has been achieved over the last 5 years. Around 90% of the capital budget supports infrastructure, and net Scottish Government direct capital investment has totalled nearly 23 billion in that period from 2016-17 to the end of this financial year 2021. As set out in prior Infrastructure Investment Plan annual reports, this is estimated to have supported around 30,000 jobs. A subset of such investment has been considered historically by this committee, focusing on major projects and certain programmes. So projects over 20 million capital value have been reported every 6 months alongside programmes with a capital value of over 50 million. So 117 major projects with a capital value of £7 billion have been completed since 2016. More will be reported as complete in the next annual report due at the end of this financial year. Our programme pipeline has seen major investment in the delivery of superfast broadband, affordable housing, school buildings, the expansion of early learning and childcare, and in city region deals, for example. As shown in the last 6 monthly report, 4 major multi-year projects will continue from this phase into the next parliamentary term as part of our new Infrastructure Investment Plan. Those are Aberdeen Baird Family Hospital and Anchor Centre, HMP Highland, HMP Glasgow, and the Dunfermline Learning Campus. These are all fully funded in the future capital spending review and in the next Infrastructure Investment Plan, covering the 5-year period from 2021-22 to 2025-26, both published on the 4th of February this year. Similarly, major ongoing programmes, such as relating to elective care facilities and the A9 and A96, which were intended to be delivered over a longer period than in the phase up to 2021. They're also set out in the next infrastructure investment plan and funded through the capital spending review, so committee members can be assured of the continuity. All of which allows me just briefly to draw attention to certain ongoing improvements we've sought to make in the information available to this committee for scrutiny. For example, since 2016, we have provided an overview to our annual infrastructure investment plan reporting each April. This strengthens the strategic information available to the committee, provides context for the overall capital investment and shares much more information as requested from time to time by members. The next infrastructure investment plan, up to 2025-26, covers all portfolios, all major investments synchronised over the same 5-year time frame with a common vision and 3 key themes. Not only is there a plan of what the government is choosing to invest in, that ambition is matched with a funding package to ensure it happens. This strengthens the strategic intent of the Scottish Government's capital and infrastructure investment, which started with the National Infrastructure Mission announced in the Programme for Government in September 2018. The next infrastructure investment plan is larger than this one, a pipeline of 26 billion of itemised work within more than £33 billion of capital allocations. That's approaching 50% larger than the last 5 years through a combination of actions at Scottish Minister's hand, deployment of fiscal framework powers, revenue financed agreements, capital grants and financial transaction allocations. This is estimated to grow the jobs supported number to 45,000, a vital part of supporting Scotland through its recovery from the economic shock that has mirrored the public health shock of the coronavirus. Within that, 2 billion of new investment will focus on increasing.
Sorry, can I interrupt, please? I just don't know how much longer you have left. We usually just have a couple of minutes at the start. I mean, this is very useful, but if you could draw your remarks to a close, that would be super. Thank you.
I will. Thank you.
Thank
you. I will. So these are areas of the next infrastructure investment plan, and we will be reporting those obviously to the successor of this committee in future. There's certainly more changes that we're looking to do to help the committee, one of which is about actually going into greater granularity of what we report. I can say more about that later if that's helpful. And I'm always keen to consider any insights and reflections this committee wishes to offer as we prepare to report on these new projects and programmes in the next Parliament. But for now, my colleagues and I will be happy to answer your questions. Convener, I'll just pause for a moment before we start, just, if I may, to allow any of my colleagues to indicate if they have any interest to be declared. Thank you.
Witnesses have any interest to be declared? Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Convener, I think Kerry Alexander was looking to come in.
Sorry, I can't see everyone because we have such... Yes, Kerry.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to note that I'm a Public Interest Director in the Inverness College NPD company. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Okay, I would like to say that we've received, before we move to questions, we've received apologies from Gail Ross MSP this morning. She's not able to join us. I'm going to ask Colin Beattie to open questioning for the committee, please.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to explore some of the issues around delays in the project and issues about obviously the COVID-19 shutdown of some of the construction sites. Now, there are delays that are being anticipated on a number of the projects. I wondered, firstly, what attempts have been made to recover the lost time that's been associated with the shutdown of construction sites?
Colin, can I ask you, is it possible that you can direct your question, just given that we have such a large panel this morning, to Scottish Government, Transport Scotland or the Scottish Futures Trust? That would help us a little bit.
I think possibly this would be for Kerry Alexander, if I can.
Kerry, please.
Just.
Yes, I'm happy to offer some thoughts on that, and perhaps Gary Gillespie might have something to say too. So sites were able to reopen in June, which followed a massive collaborative effort across industry, government and wider stakeholders. And I guess the first thing was that there was sector-specific site operating guidance that was developed and deployed through the Leadership Forum. And that had been repurposed, that forum, for COVID recovery and chaired by the Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government. So the two actions then, the Construction Forum moved on from the guidance to getting an industry recovery plan together. And that plan was published in consultation form in September and finalised in October. And there are 5 joint subgroups that are taking forward a range of actions from that plan. The other action, as well as the industry recovery plan, is around ensuring transparency of pipeline of project opportunities. And of course, the publication of the IIP and the capital spending review in draft in September and in final form earlier this month is a major step in terms of setting out specific announcements. So, for example, one of the ones from a Scottish Futures Trust perspective that we would be able to talk more to is the announcement around about the 27 projects in the second phase of the LEAP programme as an example of additional pipeline. But Gary may be able to offer more thoughts just on that broader perspective as to where the sector is.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, I was just checking, I was off mute. So I think just in responding to Mr. Beattie, it's maybe worth me just saying a little bit about where the aggregate construction output is. Obviously, his question about the recovery of the sector, both in terms of projects and sites. At the aggregate level, as we've seen, obviously construction essentially was impacted by the first major national lockdown. And over that period, the 23rd of March to the end of April, construction activity contracted by over 50% in Scotland, 53%. So that was a significant impact, and really it was only much more significant in the consumer-facing sectors of the economy at that time. And since then, what we've seen is the construction sector activity has come back. Growth returned in May. I think non-essential construction came back in June, and we've seen growth through the period through to November for the construction sector activity in Scotland. Where the sector is now, it remains about 9%, 9.4% below its pre-pandemic level. It contracted in December for the first time since April, and is slightly in an overall Scotland position. Scottish output in total is about 7.2% below, so construction activity has been impacted. But if you look at the scale of the impact from the first national lockdown, essentially a 50% contraction over those 2 months, the fact that the sector's been able to trade and continue trading even through level 4 has meant it's been able to regain much of that lost output. But I'll stop there, and I'm happy to come in a little bit more if you want some further input on the resilience of the sector or how it's performing more generally.
I think Alison Stafford wants to come in, but can I just add to the question? There's substantial delays showing on some of these projects, and yet there seems to be an anticipation that it will have a very limited impact on cost. Could you maybe comment on that as well, because it is surprising? I think that's Alison.
Alison Stafford, please.
Yes, happy to come in. So I think you're right, Mr. Beattie, in that there will be areas where the lost time and some elements of cost will have an ongoing impact. And that's not least because of the fact that there will be still necessary public health safeguards, physical distancing and hygiene requirements on site, some higher staff absence rates that we've been seeing through this year, sadly both from infection and the need for isolation, and an impact on supply chain, for example, from firms who have had to reduce or suspend production during the pandemic. So there are colleagues on this call who may be able to comment more specifically about where they are seeing projects that are in our programme delayed. So I would like to invite Bill Reeve and Alan from Health, Bill from Transport, just to say a little bit more about those specific examples. and how far they're able to be quantified at this particular time. But inevitably, pre-COVID programmes have been affected by the restrictions, and it would be unreasonable to expect otherwise. But and convener, just generally, because it is quite a broad group, I'm happy if you want to field the questions initially to me, and then I can bring in colleagues who have the necessary sort of knowledge base to save committee members sort of having to guess where the right place is to get the best answer. Thanks.
Thank you, Alison. Colin, do you want to hear from the witnesses Alison suggested on this, or do you want to move on?
Perhaps I can move on to something which is coming out of some market participants that I've been speaking to. They're talking of shortages of materials impacting on projects, and partly that seems to be because of COVID, but partly also because of Brexit, because a surprising amount of our building materials seems to come from Europe. And on the back of that, they've got a shortage of skilled workers, which they're expecting to be hugely exacerbated because projects down in England for HS2 and other major projects are going to suck in highly paid workers to take part and participate in those projects. Have you any projections as to how this is going to impact on our projects here in Scotland?
So, Mr. Beattie, I would turn to both Gary Gillespie, just in terms of that broader sector, and also to Bill Reeve for some specific things in relation to transport, where these areas may well be prevalent. Thank you.
Gary Gillespie, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a brief comment, I suppose, on the building materials point and the EU, post-EU exit points. We're obviously seeing a combination of that and COVID restrictions. So we know in the housing sector, home refurbishments, trying to get materials as pipelines and construction and manufacturing, particularly manufacturing, have been reduced due to restrictions within workplaces. I think within construction, it's also a very mobile workforce. It works across the UK, and there's always been issues around ensuring that we have a sufficient pipeline of projects to make it attractive for workers to be in Scotland. I think that's always been an ongoing issue, and it will continue to be an issue post-EU exit, given the importance of EU workers within the construction sector in Scotland and across the UK.
Does anyone else want to comment on that particular aspect?
I think Alison suggested Bill Reeve. Bill, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I think I'd recognise the areas of concern that Mr. Beattie has raised. Interestingly, just this morning from my Railfreg contacts, I picked up that there is a big surge in the movement of construction materials just this week. I think that reflects as much other factors like the severe weather being a limit on construction activity, as well as some of the other impediments to progress we've had in the last year. In terms of things like HS2 and the shortage of skilled staff that might give rise to, I think our best defence against that is what we're already doing, which is as much visibility as possible on the pipeline of projects that we are planning to deliver, so that the supply base can plan on that basis, and actually maintaining confidence in the supply base that we will come good with those projects. So keeping that rolling programme of investment going is important to, and what we find is that is sufficient in itself to cause the construction industry to allocate its resources to what it finds to be an attractive and dependable Scottish construction market.
Perhaps just one last question, which is, we're obviously in lockdown at the moment. The pandemic continues. The indication of delays were that 11 projects anticipated delays of 4 months or less, with 6 anticipating 6 to 10 months. Are we likely to see further delays coming out of this particular lockdown in terms of the project completion?
So, convener, if I start, and then I would turn to Bill and Alan to add anything from their perspective. And I'm not sure if Gemma wants to come in, but certainly those two. So it really just depends about the impact of ongoing guidance and restrictions. and the safe operating guidance obviously will affect different sites differently. A large civil engineering groundwork site where the operations involve individuals working largely in machine cabs or outdoors may not be significantly affected at all. However, for larger building sites where it's maybe at the internal fit out stage, the programme may have required multiple trades to be working in close proximity, and those projects may still be experiencing what might be described as a productivity reduction, but a necessary reduction to maintain public health and to stick to current guidelines, so that, a consequent delay. And I think the distinction may well be drawn out by Bill's experience in his area, and maybe slightly differentially for Alan. So I'd like to bring in those two colleagues as well, please.
Alan Morrison, please. Alan Morrison.
Yeah, Alison's right. In health projects, we are seeing delays as a result of COVID. And you may have seen over the weekend that the refurbishment of one of the children's cancer wards in Glasgow, the site was shut down because a number of the tradespeople working on the site contracted COVID. It's an internal project with kind of poor ventilation and relatively a small space. So the challenges of working in these kind of environments are kind of recognised. And obviously, when you're behind schedule with a project, what you would typically consider is putting more people on site. So that really is not an option open to us with the requirements around social distancing. So I would expect to see of the major health projects, it would not be a surprise if timelines were pushed out yet again as a result of COVID restrictions.
And Bill Reeve?
Those of us who necessarily are restricted to working at home at the moment, it's sobering to reflect on, and we ought to pay tribute to those who continue to deliver essential projects for Scotland at the minute. But their safety remains absolutely a priority, and indeed the safety of those with whom they interact. So could we say that there will be no further impact of COVID on programmes or cost on a project-by-project basis? I think it would be imprudent and frankly implausible to give that assurance at the moment. What we can say is that there's an awful lot of work and best practice being applied to mitigate those impacts. But just to give one illustration, I think as the REC committee certainly already knows, it was necessary to suspend construction activity at the Ferguson yard in January this year because of the high infection rates in the Inverclyde area, and I think that's just one illustration of the risks that do continue to occur, although we very much hope they will reduce as we're able to move out of the current restrictions in the course of the next year.
Okay, thank you very much. Colin, do you have anything further?
No, thank you, Convener, that's me.
Okay, thank you. Alex Neil, please.
Thank you, Convener. Can I start by asking about the social housing plans and budget? In her statement, original budget statement to Parliament for next year, the Finance Secretary appeared to cut the social housing budget by about £270 million, and then she reinstated, I think I'm right in saying, £125 million. So can Alison and her team please tell us what is the state of the social housing budget, and how do future plans compare, say, over the next 5 years compared to the spend over the last 5 years?
Mr. Neil, thank you for your question. I would like to ask Rachel Guyon, please, to respond to your question. Thank you.
Rachel, please. Rachel, are you?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. I can't see you, but I can hear you, yes.
Excellent. So over the last 5 years, the affordable housing programme totalled around £3.5 billion. And as Mr Neil may be aware, we have not yet received consequentials as we would have expected from the UK government relating to housing. So we are somewhere £500 million shy of what would normally have been expected. What Scottish ministers have done is sought to protect the capital grant funding for housing, and a combination of what was in the initial budget bill at introduction and what has subsequently been made available would restore the affordable housing programme back to the level of the last 5 years. In particular, we have experienced a fall in financial transactions, the type of money that was always so useful to the housing programme, of just over 2/3. And within that, using the extended powers we now have to draw down from the Scotland Reserve in the next 2 financial years only because of the impact of COVID, again, Scottish ministers have put an additional 100 million of financial transactions on top of what was already in the Scottish budget plans into the housing programme.
So as things stand, Rachel, compared to the £3.5 billion during the last 5 years, and I take the point about the cutback in financial transactions money and other, still waiting on more information about additional consequentials from the budget next week at the UK level. But as things stand at the moment, over the next 5 years, how much money, in comparison to the £3.5 billion for the next 5 years, what figure are we at the moment?
We are in line with that 3.5. We were just at 3.3 at introduction, and then extra funding has gone in.
Right. So we're more or less at the moment at even Stephen, as it were.
Yes.
And if there are more consequentials from the UK budget, is there a policy to give priority to earmarking more funding for social housing? Because apart from anything else, there is inflation. Inflation in the construction sector has traditionally been higher than overall inflation. So we won't get the same output for the £3.5 billion input. So we need to put more money in to get the same out. So is social housing a priority for any additional consequentials for capital spending coming out of the UK budget?
Scottish ministers and Ms Forbes is paying very close attention to all the needs, including housing, and has written to the Chancellor to seek clarity on the funding proposals from the UK government on housing, because a large amount was announced and we just haven't seen that flow yet. So the first priority is to understand exactly how the funding is coming, and then when the funding, if any, arrives on the 3rd of March, I'm sure Ms Forbes will be looking at all the needs in the round, including that.
So just to be clear then, the additional consequentials that we're already due that still need to be clarified, but the additional consequentials arising from increased spending in housing south of the border, if and when we get that money, are told how much it's going to be, that money will also be allocated to additional social housing in Scotland. Is that right?
When the money comes in, as you know, Scottish ministers look at their funding across the piece. They have already put a large amount of money into housing. So I think the first thing to do is get clarity whether and what extra is coming here, and then to take a view in the round of all the priorities, including housing.
Right. Okay, so as things stand then, over the last 5 years, we had a housing programme of 50,000 houses, 35,000 of which were new build social housing. So what are the comparable figures for the next 5 years?
As you will be probably aware, the Cabinet Secretary for Housing and Communities is looking at the forward strategy together with the stakeholders, and I'm sure there will be some news coming forward in due course.
Is due course before the 25th of March?
I think that is something that would be better answered by the housing portfolio on their plans, but I'm aware that work has been underway and is progressing well with the stakeholders.
Could you find out for us and write to us, please? Let us know, because is very important. I don't think, given the huge demand now, pressures on social housing, with a substantially increased population, reduction in the size of households, and the waiting lists there are huge pressures on social housing in Scotland, and it really has to be a top priority in the next 5 years. So I'd appreciate it if you could get your equivalent officials in the housing section to update us, please, on these figures and where they're at. Would that be okay?
That's totally fine, yes.
Great, thank you. Convener, can I now go to Bill Reeves in terms of transport? If Alison's happy for Bill to answer the question. I'll declare an interest as Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure. A number of years ago, I introduced the commitment to dual the A9 between Perth and Inverness by 2025 and to dual the A96 between Aberdeen and Inverness by 2030. And when those two projects are complete, it will mean that every city in Scotland is linked up either by motorway or dual carriageway. I am absolutely perplexed, as I cannot get an answer to the question, what is the estimated completion date now for the dualling of the A9 between Inverness and Perth, and for the dualling of the A96 between Aberdeen and Inverness? Can Bill tell us, please?
And it's good to see you again. I think we last met on Shot's platform, if memory serves. I'd agree with you about the importance of connecting our 7 cities with both good road and rail links, you'd expect me to say. So in terms of the A9, you'll be aware that the first section of the upgrade is already open between Kincraig and Dalradi. You'll know that the Lunkerty to Burnham section is in construction, and I'm pleased to say that that work has restarted with the COVID restrictions necessary, but nonetheless it has restarted. The remaining sections of the A9 are still in the process of the necessary statutory procedures to determine the alignment. That work is being pressed forward as fast as we can, but of course we are engaged with the necessary process around things like compulsory purchase of land, so we need to take full account of that. And 8 out of the 9 remaining sections of the A9 are going through that statutory procedures process at the moment, which then allows us to undertake the market consultation around the best procurement method. So work is pressing on those. On the A96, the statutory consent process is underway, and on Inverness to Nairn, the reporters have now submitted their report from the public local inquiry to ministers, and that's being considered. And I'm cautiously optimistic that the conclusions from that will emerge before too long. No, I can't give you a date, but I can say I'm cautiously optimistic they will emerge before too long. There's good progress with the development and assessments on the Hardmuir to Fochabers section. And east of Huntly to Aberdeen, there's a virtual exhibition on the preferred option opened in December of last year, and such has been the level of interest in that that the exhibition has been extended, the virtual exhibition extended till the 8th of March. To give you a sense of the scale of that activity, so far we've had something like 18,000 virtual visits to the various plans on the A96. So it's always frustrating at this stage when we can't give the firm dates for the next stage of the programme, but we can't do that until we've gone through the necessary statutory process. You'll permit me to observe we have in the meantime improved the railway between Aberdeen and Inverness, at least in the first phase as well. So you know, we continue that balanced programme of investment.
Okay, that's very helpful, Bill, but I've got 2 outstanding questions. My first one is that the decisions on these 2 roads was to dual them was taken by the Cabinet in 2011-12. Why has it taken 10 years, particularly on the A9, the completion target date being the 2025, and we're still doing statutory orders? Surely to God that should all have been done long before now. And secondly, what is the objective still? Is it still the policy of the government to finish the dualling of the A9 between Perth and Inverness by 2025 or thereabouts? And is it still the policy of the government to try to complete the dualling of the Aberdeen A96 between Aberdeen and Inverness by 2030 or thereabouts? Or are these projects being quietly shoved into the long grass?
Oh, pardon me, Neil. No, absolutely not. I think my roads colleagues, if they were here with me, would be able to reassure you about the sheer scale of activity that's underway on both of those axes. It is the case that we're engaging with both the stakeholders along the route and the construction industry. So I should absolutely answer your question. Yes, it remains the policy to dual the A9 all the way to Inverness. Absolutely, it does. There is necessarily going to be some reflection on the feedback we get from the construction industry over the course of this year, and doubtless there will be updates when we get that feedback. But we remain absolutely committed to the delivery of both the A9 and the A96 as soon as is practically possible.
Well, I look forward to an official invitation to the official opening of both of them. I hope I live long enough, Bill. Thank you very much.
I look forward to seeing you there, Mr. Neil.
Couple of supplementaries.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Mr. Neil. A couple of supplementaries on those road questions. Bill Reeve, the first one from me. You said that 8 out of 9 sections of the A9 are undergoing the statutory process. Which one isn't?
I'm afraid I don't actually have that information. You'll forgive me. This is the perils of having the rail director speaking about a road project. But I will find that and write to you.
Can you please write to me and tell me which one and why that isn't undergoing the statutory process at the moment? That would be very helpful.
I will indeed.
Thank you very much. Graham Simpson, you wanted to ask a question on this topic as well, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I was as perplexed as Alex Neil when I read these reports. So I just want to be clear, Bill Reeve. On the A96, there was a report that I read, I think it was in the Scotsman, that said that project could be, quotes, delayed indefinitely. So are you saying that the A96 will be completed at some stage?
But I don't know what the source of that report was about delayed indefinitely, but it's not a programme plan I would recognise.
So are you saying the A96 will be completed at some point?
It remains our policy to complete the dualling of the A96.
And so it will be completed?
Well, yes, that absolutely remains our policy.
Right. And on the A9, so we've heard that it was due to be fully dualled by 2025. There now appears to be a quite inexplicable delay. It could be by 2030. Could it be any later than 2030?
So I think we've already talked, I think, about some of the factors that have contributed to the delays, particularly in the last year, particularly on things like Luncarty to Burnham section in construction at the minute. And of course, the development on other sections does require site visits as well, and they have necessary things like ground investigation and so forth, and survey work. So there have been delays to that. It is my expectation that later this year, after some of those market engagements I talked about, it will be possible to confirm whether the current targets remain deliverable or whether there needs to be any alteration to those. But at the minute we are working we are continuing to work to recover programmes where possible, where they have slipped, and to press on with the development work that I've outlined.
What is the current target, 2025 or 2030?
Well, as I have it, it's 2025 for the A9, and and 2030 for the A96.
So still working to 2025.
Those are the targets that the teams are pressing on to deliver. Right.
So can you come back to the committee and say whether or not we will hit 2025 on the A9 and 2030?
Well, I think we'll have the next meaningful assessment of that, taking account of both the impact of COVID and of the market feedback with both the engagement of the stakeholders and with the market engagement of the construction industry. I think it's unlikely to be before the summer of this year that we will have that revised assessment.
Okay, that strikes me as ludicrous given the amount of time we've been looking at both projects. However, if I can just go back to Rachel, is that okay, Convener?
Yes.
Thank you. So, Rachel, you were being asked about affordable housing, and I just want to be clear at what your position is here. You seem to be saying that you're waiting for £500,000 in consequentials, and that would boost the affordable housing budget. But then you said that any money that comes in consequentials would go into an overall pot and may not necessarily be spent on affordable housing. Am I correct in that?
There may have been a slight lack of clarity there. Our budget had to be laid, the Scottish budget, before full clarity of the UK figure. So the allocations to housing in Scotland were made on the assumption that the money from the UK would arrive as usual. So it's more that the Exchequer hasn't yet received the money to pay for the funds that have been passed on. So that's the balancing act that we are looking to do. Ms Forbes has already protected the housing budget as though she had received that funding from the UK to the largest extent she could, albeit that the financial transactions were not able similarly to be protected because they were so reduced. And that is why, because that capital grant has already been paid out to housing in advance, as it were, of us getting clarity from the UK government of whether we're going to receive funding from them, that funding's already been paid over in Scotland.
So is Kate Forbes working on the assumption she'll be getting the money, and that so the figures she's already announced based on that assumption, is that right?
She set out her assumptions for the capital spending review in September 2020 in the framework. And because at that stage we did not have the UK figures, the Scottish budget has had to be based on forecasts and the sort of estimates that are set out in documents like the medium-term financial strategy. The value of having a Scottish budget that can choose the priorities for Scotland is that housing had already been selected as a priority within the total amount of funding that we would have expected to receive, and that was set out with the financial planning assumptions last September and set out in the budget in January. The big difference that faced that budget was there was no part of forecasting that had thought it was realistic to assume a 2/3 reduction in our financial transactions. That had never been part of, in 1 year, that had never been part of the forecasting of the economists.
Sorry, I'm a little bit confused by all that. If you'll excuse me, is it going to make any difference to the affordable housing budget already announced by Kate Forbes if there are consequentials flowing from the UK budget, or have those consequentials already been factored in?
If there is extra money on the 3rd of March arriving in the UK budget, decisions will need to be taken at that point.
But there is no guarantee that extra money will go to affordable housing.
There is no guarantee we will receive any funds, and there are a range of interests that have been expressed to Ms Forbes, including from parliamentary parties and others, on the use of any funds that do arrive in Scotland. So I'm sure she will look at that whole situation in the round.
Okay. Convener, I've got other questions, but it's up to you whether I just carry on.
I have Bill Bowman first, Graham, so if you don't mind, I'm going to move to Bill and then I'll come back to you. Okay?
Okay.
Bill Bowman, please.
Okay, thank you, Convener, and good morning. If I can follow on in the same sort of general direction as Colin Beattie, but with something more specific. I think Alison mentioned in her introduction HM Prison Glasgow. Now, on page 3 of the Major Capital Project Update, there are some details given about that. Now, this committee's report on the 2018-19 audit of the Scottish Prison Service raised delays in HMP Glasgow and the impact on the existing estate. At that point, the Chief Executive of the Prison Service estimated that the new Barlinnie would be ready in 2024-25. The project update, the update now says that its operational start is September 26. So, what are the specifics that have caused that delay? How realistic is this timescale, and what does it mean for the existing estate? I mean, this is a huge site with people working there, people being housed there in less than ideal conditions.
Convener, Mr. Bowman, I realise there's quite a lot of detail in the question that you are asking. Rachel will respond to the extent that she is able. It may well be, though, that to get you the fullest response, we may need to follow up in writing, and very happy to organise that. Rachel, are you able to come in initially? And as I say, we will follow up if Rachel isn't able to answer all of your questions.
Can I just say, Alison, from the work the committee has done over the past few years, I think we consider this one of the key infrastructure projects, so as much detail as possible would be very welcome. Gemma,
understood.
Please.
Sorry, Rachel.
Sorry, Rachel. My screen went to Gemma. We're waiting for Rachel. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. So in terms of Barlinnie itself, the site acquisition is now complete, and I understand that construction work is currently scheduled to commence in the summer of 2023. And clearly Barlinnie is part of a whole programme of work to help modernise the prison estate, with very significant plans, for example, for the female estate, where significant funding was made available in 2015-16, and at that time ministers wished to ensure they had the right vision for the female custodial estate and revised the plans in a way that received cross-party and stakeholder support. So why is that important for the other parts of the programme? And it's that all of these need to be sequenced. So the priority is concluding the female estate, and then Highland and Barlinnie are proceeding at pace as the next stages of work. There is a chosen site for Highland, which will come on stream slightly earlier, and then Barlinnie with the updated information that has now been shared with the committee in the last update and just now. What you'll also be able to see in the capital spending review is the full funding that goes alongside those plans through that 5 years to give the multi-year certainty to SPS as it looks to deliver on those establishments.
So is that it? That's all we know. It's going to take another over 2 years before they even start because somebody hasn't put together a vision and a sequencing. I don't really follow that. I mean, this is a very urgent project. We were told it was very urgent, very important to get it going. You've got the site built, but what is stopping getting on with it? Not the site built, site acquired. Is it admin that's stopping it starting?
The information I have is obviously you start with the acquisition of the site, and then the planning permission and design needs to follow on from that, and then it heads into the final business case, procurement, the construction. All of those things are now underway, and the site and the planning and design is a major part of being able to start well and finish on time and budget.
But what put it back 2 years from the last time we heard?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
I'm saying what put it back a further 2 years from the last time we heard about this?
I hold the information the portfolio shared with me, and we update the committee. If there's further detail, I think we'd need to go back to the Justice portfolio.
Well, I mean, it's a bit disappointing. This was sufficiently important to be mentioned in the quite lengthy introduction, but we don't seem to have the detail here. So can anybody tell us what it means for the existing estate, this delay?
In terms of managing the prison population?
Well, we're having to run a site for at least another extra 2 years, and it was still way beyond its sell-by date. Has this not got some consequence?
Improvement works are indeed underway at the existing site to make that operationally the best environment it can be just now. There are upgrades to the prisoner reception area and to healthcare facilities. A contractor's already been appointed, and construction work is starting later this spring on those as well, and those are fully funded.
So what is the additional cost for that?
It is in the small number of millions, but off the top of my head, I don't have that figure.
Well, to me, there's not a small number of millions. I think, convener, we perhaps have to ask for some more detail from people who know about this.
I would agree, Mr. Bowman. I mean, when we took evidence on this from the previous Auditor General, she was very, very concerned. Barlinnie, according to her, I think it was about 18 months ago, was 50% over capacity, and there didn't seem to be a contingency plan for the prison population in there if something went wrong. But we're really, all that time on, we're really not getting much more information about how the new building has progressed. Alison Stafford, can you add to this and tell us why that is, please?
So I think the best thing we can do is to actually follow up your specific questions with Justice colleagues and get back to you as soon as possible.
I mean, it is really concerning because we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 witnesses here this morning, and it's a key project and we can't get these answers.
So that's why we will write, so you do get the best information.
Mr. Bowman, have you got any further questions?
I don't think I should take up time asking questions that nobody knows the answer to.
Okay. Okay, Graham Simpson, we'll come back to you then, please.
Yeah, thanks, convener. Let's see if we could do any better on ferries. I don't know who wants to answer this, possibly Bill Reeve. So we've got two ferries at the moment sitting in Ferguson shipyard, not finished. You mentioned earlier there's been a delay due to COVID. I accept that, but that's not the entire reason for the delay. There are a whole host of reasons. The whole thing has been a shambles. The first question on those two ferries: do we know when they'll be finished?
The last target dates that I have available, and they were the ones that Parliament was advised of, I think, in summer of last year, was April to June 2022 for 801, and December to February 23 for 802. As I think I've already mentioned, we know that the as well as the normal disruption of normal, if that's the right word, disruption of construction activity in the yard last year, there's been a further suspension of construction activity regrettably because of the high infection rates in Inverclyde in January of this year, and I know Parliament's been advised of that already. So Tim Hare, who's the turnaround director of Ferguson Marine at the minute, has been commissioned to review the programme, and my understanding is that he will be producing an update later this year, and it will be appropriate to assess any impact on the programme at that point. But that exercise is underway at the moment.
Right, I understand. Well, I think Mr.
And perhaps just that the main impact is exactly that COVID impact that we've talked about. That's what's changed since the last day.
Well, that's just added to years of delay that were already there.
Indeed.
Yes. Now, has Transport Scotland done any analysis of how many ferries Scotland is going to need? How many new ferries Scotland is going to need in the next 5 years and 10 years? And has Transport Scotland figured out how we're going to get these ferries? Will it be, well, heaven forbid, procuring new ones or leasing ones that already exist?
Yes is the simple answer to that. I think in the current budget under consideration, there's some 580 million set aside for ferries over the next 5 years in the round, which will kind of build on the 291 million we've invested since 2007, as well as the investment that goes into the harbours as well. So just thinking of the discussions we've had within Transport Scotland on major projects at the minute, we've been looking at an additional vessel for or a new vessel for the Isle of Ferries service, looking at replacing up to 8 of the small lock class vessels and the extent to which we can move to a procurement in the course of next year for those. Seeking, of course, to see what we can do to standardise those designs and move towards lower emission ferries wherever possible. That brings with it the need very often to invest in the infrastructure for things like electric power supplies. We've got work underway looking at the right solution for Ardrossan and indeed improving the infrastructure on the Skye Triangle of services, and likewise further consideration of the needs of the Gurrock Dunoon to Kilcreggan service. So all of those are actively under consideration in answer to your question.
Okay. Is there any document you could send us?
There are lots of documents. Forgive me.
Well,
particular. I mean, I'd be very happy to provide a summary of what I've just set out, if that would be helpful.
That would be useful. Yeah. Okay.
Certainly.
Thank you, convener.
On Ferguson Marine and the ferries project, I'm looking at the table that you helpfully provided us with. Bill Reeves, can you just remind the committee how much public money has been ploughed into Ferguson, please?
Do you mean for the procurement of the vessel, or do you mean separately for the investment in the yard itself?
The investment in the yard.
I'm afraid I'm better able to talk about the former than the latter, because the former is the transport issue. The latter is sort of a matter of industrial policy. But I think we are looking at, in the round, costs for these two vessels being in the order of a couple of $100 million. And clearly the final figure remains to be determined, and that in part depends on the work that Tim Hare is doing at the moment.
Okay. The last piece of your update on the table said that the Scottish Government's identifying options for a sustainable future for the yard going forward, of course, because it is publicly owned now at the expense of the taxpayer. And has the potential to operate in such a way to allow it to secure public and private work. Now, these two ferries will be completed, hopefully in the next couple of years. Can you tell us if you know of any further contracts that the yard has secured?
Well, again, forgive me, I can tell you about our plans for procurement of ferries. I'm not the best person to answer the questions about the business of Ferguson's as a yard. That's a sort of matter of industrial policy rather than transport policy. But clearly the investment in new ferries the Scottish Government wish to make will give rise to a set of procurements, and those clearly are things that for which Ferguson's would have the opportunity to bid, I would imagine that its future would benefit from looking more widely than just Scottish Government shipping contracts as well.
No, absolutely. And they're going to have to make sure this is value for money for the taxpayer. Alison Stafford, do you have any knowledge of how they're getting on with future business plan since it's been subsidised by the taxpayer?
So as Bill said, it would be those working more specifically in terms of the economic development side of things. So that would be the best place, and we can again follow up on that if that's helpful to the committee.
That would be really helpful. Thank you very much. Graham Simpson, do you have anything further?
I'm happy for you to move on, convener.
Okay. Bill Reeves, I have a question for you. Sorry, we seem to be focusing a lot on your area today, but I have something specific to your area of rail. You'll be glad to know.
You're interested in the important matter of transport. Yes.
The tragic accident outside Stonehaven where the line collapsed last summer with the loss of life. Can you maybe give the committee an update? I mean, obviously we know that rail infrastructure in Scotland is partly Network Rail and, partly falls to Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government. Can you please tell us what is going on in terms of improvement to that line so that this type of accident never happens again?
Gosh, yes, that's been a sobering incident. So where do we start? Well, firstly, just for clarity, the Scottish Government is responsible for the specification and funding of Network Rail in Scotland, but Network Rail is a company that's a wholly owned subsidiary of the UK Government, as I'm sure you're aware. But clearly we work closely with our delivery partners in Network Rail and indeed the wider rail industry. Stonehaven was a sobering demonstration of the reality of climate change and its impact. Now, in the high-level output specification that the Scottish Government gave Network Rail for the current 5-year regulatory control period, we included a requirement that it should address the impact of climate change in its maintenance and infrastructure renewal plans. And indeed, there is a substantial increase in the budget for such works provided for within that overall 5-year settlement. And even at Stonehaven, tragically, the accident was caused by a landslip and a cutting on an approach to a bridge. And the train, as you may know, was derailed when it was knocked sideways from the track when it hit the abutment at the bridge. But that bridge was already the subject of climate mitigation work. So part of the reason that helped, mercifully, the access to the site afterwards was that the access had already been improved because there were scour protection works underway. That's to prevent higher levels of rainfall in the stream underneath, scouring the foundations of the bridge. So sorry, I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but there's an illustration that the need to adapt our transport infrastructure, both road and rail, to the reality of climate change is well understood. And the work was already underway before Stonehaven.
I suppose I'm asking you if you are confident that work is being done quickly enough on the climate change mitigation programme and other works to ensure the safety of our railways?
So the safety of the railway is the responsibility of the Office of Rail and Road, but I can provide assurance that the work to address these risks was already well underway, is being taken extremely seriously. I know that Network Rail has commissioned independent reviews, both of its practices in earthworks management and indeed of best practice in meteorology. And I've not seen myself yet those reports, but I understand they'll be made available shortly. So I can provide the committee with assurance that best practices are being applied wherever possible. And I can also say that things like operational procedures have been reviewed and changed, reflecting some of the lessons already learnt. And it's a bit sobering, really, but we are watching a steady growth in incidents of high intensity localised rainfall. That's a pattern across Great Britain, but we know that it's accelerating faster in Scotland than it is further south. That's just a matter of meteorological fact. So, sorry, we could talk at great length about this, but I can provide assurance this is being treated by our Network Rail delivery partners with the utmost seriousness, and that the funding that the Scottish Government has made available for them within this period contains an increased level of funding in order to make the delivery of the necessary works possible.
Okay, it might be useful, Bill, I think witnesses have committed to come back to the committee with more information on a number of topics already this morning, or perhaps a breakdown of the critical projects that you're dealing with in this area of climate mitigation on the railways, and how they're progressing and timescales for them would be really helpful if that's possible.
So perhaps the committee would be interested in a quick an update on the progress, the lessons learned already, the progress already made, and the next steps, because you'll be aware that that's a matter of wide, naturally wide interest. So I can certainly undertake to provide the latest state of progress with Network Rail.
That would be that'd be extremely helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Do members have any other questions for the witnesses? Okay, can I just ask for a quick overview on the women's prison facilities? One of these facilities is due to be built in Dundee. It's been delayed for quite a long time now. I've visited the site myself, but can you give us, I think it's your latest update that you provided to committee now says May 2022. Can we expect it to open next May? I don't know who I'm directing this question to, Alison Stafford. Maybe you can help me with.
Of course. Rachel will be able to give you what she has available. So Rachel, please.
That 2022 date is the latest I hold, yes.
So you're expecting it to open on next May?
The information I have is that it is scheduled to be delivered then.
Okay. And will there be additional cost?
The latest cost information would have been included in the September update report, and we will have another update due just around the end of this financial year, which will give any progress on any of the projects around the cost aspect at that time.
So that's 72.6 million. It says the September cost is the same as the March report, 72.6 million, is that correct?
I am just seeking to find that project on the list I have of which will be the same as our published document if that's what's published.
That's for both projects, isn't it, Rachel? Okay. Maybe you could come back and clarify that as well. That would be really useful.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay. Any further questions from members from the team from the Scottish Government this morning? Okay, I won't run through everything you're going to come back to us on. I think the clerks will have made a note and will liaise with Alison Stafford. Alison, can I thank you very much for your opening statement. This is also not the easiest session for any of us to do because there's so many of us. So I appreciate your patience and forbearance this morning. Thank you very much indeed for your evidence. I'm going to suspend for a couple of minutes for a changeover of witnesses. Thank you very much. Agenda item 3 is the Section 23 report on NHS in Scotland 2020. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the meeting this morning: Stephen Boyle, Auditor General for Scotland; Angela Canning, Audit Director; Lee Johnson, Senior Manager; and Eva Thomas-Chudo, Senior Auditor, Performance and Best Value, all from Audit Scotland. Auditor General, I understand you have a brief opening statement for us, please.
Good morning, Convener. Thank you. Today I'm bringing the committee our annual report on the NHS in Scotland. This year it focuses on the NHS and Scottish Government's response to COVID-19. It also includes a brief overview of the financial and operational performance of the NHS 2019-20. Challenges that the NHS has faced as a result of COVID-19 have been unprecedented. NHS staff have worked tirelessly in difficult circumstances to deal with the demands caused by the pandemic, while maintaining access to essential services, reflecting their extraordinary commitment to. The Scottish Government had difficult decisions to make about how to prevent the NHS from becoming overwhelmed during the pandemic. During the first wave, non-urgent treatment and national screening programmes were paused. There are longer-term risks associated with some of these decisions. The Scottish Government needed to create additional capacity for COVID-19 patients. There is therefore now a significant backlog of patients waiting to be seen, but the pandemic is ongoing. Continuing to respond to it is resource intensive and is taking priority over resuming the full range of NHS. The way the NHS delivers its work has also changed drastically, with many new approaches established. Several large-scale initiatives, such as COVID-19 Community, the now widespread use of virtual appointments, and procurement and distribution of huge amounts of personal protective equipment, PPE, together with the NHS Louisa Jordan, were all implemented at pace and required partnership working to an extent we've not seen before. Going forward, stable collaborative leadership will be required to remobilise and renew the NHS so that it can build upon the innovation and learning from it. Convener, COVID-19 hasn't affected everyone equally. Those from our most deprived communities, certain ethnic minority backgrounds, are more likely to have been hospitalised, have died after contracting COVID-19. Scotland's long-standing health inequalities addressed. The Scottish Government could have been better prepared, and planning for a pandemic had not been sufficiently prioritised. Improvements identified through pandemic preparedness exercises were not all fully implemented. There is an opportunity to learn from this. COVID-19 is expected to cost an extra £1.7 billion of expenditure across health and social care during 2020-2021. NHS boards are being fully funded, but there is uncertainty about the longer-term financial position. Convener, as ever, myself and my colleagues will do our best to answer the committee's questions this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Auditor General. I'm going to ask Colin Beattie to open questioning for the committee, please.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to ask some questions about PPE, which is obviously a major issue, especially earlier in the COVID-19 outbreak. And in your report, you state that there have been instances where the NHS board had to procure PPE directly. Were there any unintended issues by taking this direct approach to procurement? You're muted.
Morning, Mr. Beattie. Hopefully you can hear me now. I'll start and then I'll ask Angela Canning to supplement. So we do say in the report that there were issues at the early stage pandemic, and that NHS boards in particular had to take some direct steps themselves. We know in general terms that some of the procurement activity required both boards, but particularly NHS National Services Scotland, use some of the emergency procurement arrangements that were introduced in March 2020 to recognise the urgency of the situation and the need to go beyond the more standard public sector procurement arrangements. We make a recommendation in the report that it's important that as matters stabilise, that a return to more the general and the safeguards around procurement arrangements are reintroduced the earliest opportunity. We're looking at this really closely, I would say, and particularly through our annual audit of NHS National Services Scotland. We are looking at the detail of some of these contracts, careful of all of the arrangements around judgments for best value for public spending. We'll report back on the specifics of that during 2021 with more work we've got planned around PPE. But I'll ask Angela just to say some of the detailed specifics that health boards took in their procurement of PPE, if I may.
Thanks, Auditor General. I think we all know that the pandemic has brought unprecedented challenges to Scotland and to the NHS. At the start of the pandemic, there was huge challenges around PPE. There was a huge global demand for PPE, and NSS played a key role in ensuring that health boards, other social care providers as well were getting the PPE they need. So NSS have played a key role, and as the Auditor General said, we're doing planning to do some further work around PPE, and it'll be an important part of the external audit of NSS this year as well.
One thing I would be very interested in is, in the early stages of the procurement of PPE, we read horror stories about PPE being delivered that was substandard, hundreds of millions of pounds worth coming in through London. I just wonder whether any of this had a knock-on effect into Scotland. Did we end up having to bear some of the cost of the substandard PPE that was subsequently not used at all?
So I think it's not something that we've seen. It's not through our own work in assessing judgment made for this report. And as Angela mentioned, we are still got more work to do. So it's probably a bit early for us to be definitive that there haven't been any procurement difficulties or value for money concerns on wider arrangements around PPE. And it's work that we'll return to during 2021. But to give you assurance, it's not something we've seen thus far.
Now, again, we're focusing very much in the early stages of supply of PPE here. Your report refers to findings from the BMA, a member survey which found lack of access to correct or sufficient PPE, and again, RCN's survey that found that those working in high-risk environments, a fairly high proportion, didn't have their mask fit tested, and others were asked to reuse single-use equipment. Now, has there been any analysis undertaken to try and assess the impact of these issues on the health of the professionals and on the patients? You're muted.
Auditor General, can you start that again? I can't hear you, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Convener. I'll try and look out for the signal that my microphone is live in future. You're right, they're incredibly serious issues. If you'll indulge me for a second, Mr. Beattie, I think the scale of the change in use of PPE, try and illustrate that in the report. They say before the pandemic, in a typical week, NSS shipped around 97,000 items of PPE in February 2020, but that number had grown to nearly 25 million by April of 2020. So in the space of 6 weeks, truly exponential growth in the extent of PPE. So there are clearly issues. I mean, we set out the results of the survey from the Royal College of Nursing and feedback the boards reported at the time that the availability of PPE at the early stages wasn't what it needed to be. There were also issues around the quality of the PPE and the extent to which staff were given the appropriate equipment. So that's captured in these surveys and was well documented at that time. The extent to which that then led to health issues for health workers, we haven't covered that in the scope of our work yet. And it's my assumption, no more than that there'll be many reviews of the circumstances, and indeed that may well feature as part of the public inquiry to the extent as to what happened and what would allow the country to be better prepared for any subsequent pandemic circumstances. And we'll, of course, follow that closely as the government moves through that work.
I mean, this is probably a judgment, but is it possible actually to quantify the impact on health professionals and patients? Is it actually possible?
I think it probably kind of stretches the boundary of our own work, actually, and our judgment, and it's perhaps a question for the government to lead and health professionals to be better placed to make that kind of judgment. I think from our work as public auditors, it probably strays beyond the extent to which we're able to give suitable judgment upon that.
Yeah. Just one other area I'd like to touch on. Paragraph 18p, page 12 of the report says that the Scottish Government's provide PPE across the health and social care free of charge, and they've undertaken to continue doing so until the end of June 2021. However, it states that plans after that are unclear, and what happens then with those that were previously responsible for their own PPE supplies, what groups have responsibility after that date for purchasing their own PPE. Is there any work being done by the Scottish Government to identify the financial impact on these groups and what the consequences might be?
I'll ask Angela to come in again on that point, because we have, through our work, just tracked the financial cost of them, and Angela can maybe say a little bit more about what our understanding is and any insight we can share on government's plans going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Auditor General. During the pandemic, the remit of NSS was extended so that it would distribute PPE to social care providers. So, for example, those providers running care homes or running care at home services, and also to directly to general medical services, so GP surgeries, community pharmacies, and so on. Before that, those bodies would have been producing PPE directly themselves. So the guy committed to continuing to provide PPE across the health and social care sectors until the end of June this year. But what we're not clear about at this stage is whether there's any plans to continue that for another while, or whether revert back to the circumstances before the pandemic, where some providers were purchasing these items themselves.
I'm assuming from what you're saying at this particular point in time, it's uncertain when the Scottish Government is going to clarify that.
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, Bill Bowman, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Auditor General. I have two questions, the first about video consultations and the second about leadership changes. So on the first topic, your report highlights digital improvements introduced in response to the pandemic with a significant increase in video consultations. But do you have a sense of whether NHS boards expect the demand for remote consultations to continue beyond the pandemic, and have the boards made plans to continue facilitating them?
Morning, Mr. Bowman. I'll start, and then I'll invite Lee Johnson to say a little bit more in a moment about our understanding of, or an insight we have about kind of future plans. I think in general terms, though, it's been a remarkable innovation that has happened during the pandemic. I think the number that we quote in the report is that there are around 600,000 video consultations using the Near Me facility, and that level of innovation, on the face of it, is a very worthwhile introduction into the way that the NHS can conduct its services. It matters, though, that there's a full assessment of where video consultations is now placed in the future of NHS services, that the NHS boards, consultation with patients who've used the service, take a rounded view, say, well, how useful that was, the pros and cons of that service, planning, of course, access to technology and some of the inequalities points that we've touched on in previous discussions. So a sense would be that's a really, whilst worthwhile innovation during the course of a pandemic, a fuller analysis is now needed to see where that's placed in future. But I'll ask Lee just to say, look, maybe to first illustrate the scale of change and the number of consultations that took place previously, and anything further she wishes to add about what the Scottish Government is thinking about where that's placed in future.
Thank you, Auditor General. Thank you. Video consultations during the pandemic increased from about 300 per week in March 2020 to more than 18,000 per week by November 2020. And by December, more than 600,000 video consultations had taken place, as we outline in our report. I think there is every intention to continue using this technology in the government's Remobilise, Recover and Redesign framework. They outline that intention. I think we have to, as the Auditor General says, there will need to be some analysis of who it suits and who would rather have a face-to-face consultation, because obviously some people would. But I think the opportunities that it offers, for example, for our remote and rural community, a safe environment that suits people.
Thank you. Auditor General, I think your point about it needs to be looked at is a very valid one. I mean, I can see administrative benefits of seeing more patients in a shorter period of time, better use of clinicians' time. But do we know the clinical ramifications of seeing somebody just on a screen versus maybe seeing them come into a room with a limp that they didn't come for, or something like that? So will that be on your agenda? And also, will people be able to get face-to-face appointments if they want them? Would be, because I can imagine it's like pressure. I've experienced that a little bit myself with telephone consultations. And on things that you might not immediately think about, if there's an elderly person who needs some help, then they could have some confidentiality issues with somebody helping them just to log on. So will you be looking in the round about all of this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, Mr. Bowman. I think what's clear is that the growth of video consultations happened by necessity during the course of the pandemic, as direct access to services through various lockdowns was restricted, and this was a very suitable alternative for the circumstances that we were in. But you're right, it does raise wider concerns about the ability of clinicians to diagnose through physical sight, as opposed to what they may be able to see. Equally accept the point you make about confidentiality, and all of these important safeguards will need to be in place. So yes, we will have we'll retain an interest in it, and it's something for our 2021 NHS report that we'll return to, about looking more generally about the pace and the steps that the government and the NHS has taken through its programme. Make a recommendation in this report that the use of video consultation is an important part of that thinking consideration. There's that full analysis, both with clinicians, users of the service, to come to a view about where it's best placed and the balance that will exist going forward between video and face-to-face consultation.
Thank you for that. On my second question then, your report highlights an incredible number of leadership changes at senior level since April 2019. 32 new senior appointments of board chairs, chief execs, directors of finance across 21 NHS boards. So how is the Scottish Government going to achieve its ambitions for remobilisation if there's a lack of stable leadership?
One of the key recommendations we make in the report is the importance of stable leadership. Stable leadership, it matters greatly at any time, but particularly coming through the pandemic, that there is now stability of both executive and non-executive. And like you, I think when we did the analysis, that the rate of change of senior leaderships and posts in such a short space of time seemed quite surprising, but perhaps illustrates some of the challenges that have gone before. So we know government is thinking carefully about this. It's maybe something that the committee may wish to explore with government directly about the extent to which the NHS and government taking the steps to provide the support and training to new leaders in these senior posts, so that the government can fulfil its ambition through the renewed programme. But I think probably more directly is something we'll return to through our own work during 2021, but perhaps more so for the committee to explore directly with government.
Well, let me make a few suggestions what you might look at. I mean, are the recruitment procedures that we have at the moment fit for purpose? You know, have the factors influencing the high turnover been really identified, clearly identified? And is there adequate engagement at Scottish Government top level with this challenge?
So these are all valid suggestions, and I think it's the analysis. So we'll undoubtedly follow and track that and report and make additional recommendations. But it's not a particularly new topic. I think that's the thing that we talk about, and even the committee's own interest in exploring in recent times, leadership within particularly the NHS and the wider Scottish Government. So we'll certainly return to it, but I think now's the time for definitive steps and action. We cover more generally in the report the importance of integrated workforce planning. Again, also not a new topic, but it seems to now matter even more that, you know, as the renewal of the NHS and care services progresses post-pandemic, there is a clear plan for what that means for the workforce at all levels. But it's really difficult to get away from just that importance, clear, stable leadership, and the important impact that can have.
Well, we'll maybe hear more from the Scottish Government about that. Thank you very much, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Graham Simpson, please.
Thank you, Convener, and hello, Auditor General. I wonder, I've seen that there was a survey of patients. This was conducted by the Scottish Government. You refer to it in paragraph 27, saying that the number of people who said that they would avoid going to GPs or hospitals decreased from 45% in April to 27% in October. I'm just wondering whether we have any actual figures to back that up. You know, whether do we have figures on the number of people who have actually gone to the doctor as compared to pre-pandemic?
Morning, Mr. Simpson. Thank you for that. So you're right. I think I'll ask Eva to come in a second. She's been doing a lot of our data analysis to support the work in the report. We find actually that people's behaviour has changed, as I guess for all of us, during the course of the pandemic. I think we look to illustrate that both at Exhibit 4, the extent of change in A&E presentations, how that has fluctuated during the course of lockdowns and people's confidence. Undoubted wider and longer term health implications around potential misdiagnosis, and we make reference to the government's NHS's Open campaign and its importance therein. But it also, as you rightly mentioned, about the extent of people's concern or anxiety around GP presentation. I'll ask Eva just to say a little bit more about the data about that and kind of what we've seen and what that translates to in terms of numbers, if I may.
Thank you. So as the Auditor General mentioned, we have seen during the first wave quite a significant decrease in the amount of presentations to A&E, which reflects the significant amount of people saying that they would avoid going to GPs or hospitals. We haven't looked at GP attendances specifically, but as you can see, since the peak of the first wave and the NHS Open campaign, that recovered slightly. It remains below pre-COVID levels, and we'll be monitoring that in future to see whether attendances at A&E get back to pre-COVID levels.
Yeah, thanks. So for me, the attendances at A&E is only part of the picture, because your first port of call if something is wrong is normally your GP. And So I think I'd be interested to know the figures for GP referrals. You know, even if it's a video consultation. So what I'm keen to explore is, are people avoiding even contacting their GP now? I suspect the answer is yes, but we only know that if we see data.
I think.
Yeah, so we know. Oh, sorry. Across a range of services, we know that that there's been fewer referrals to hospital services, and largely those come from GP consultations referring on to hospitals. So, you know, there is an indication that that there is an issue with people not attending GP appointments when they have certain concerns that they would usually have gone to see their GP about. And again, we'll be monitoring that in future.
And I suppose that leads into the next issue I wanted to raise, and that's excess deaths. And I guess this is a question for the Auditor General. And you refer to this in paragraph 24 of your report, where you mention excess deaths of non-COVID conditions has been up. Actually, in Exhibit 3, we can see it's up all across the piece, you know, from April last year onwards. Excess deaths of things like stroke, cancer, dementia, higher than they would be normally throughout. Do you think that's because, going back to my first point, people are not presenting to doctors or hospitals, or they're just not able to get appointments?
Yeah, it's a very sobering exhibit. It's in the other report. The impact of the pandemic, I think, particularly looking at the spike that we saw between March through to June, tailing off towards June, the illustrated point of excess deaths, and for the factors around, you know, potentially missed diagnosis, change in people's behaviour, the concern of lockdown, the perception that the NHS wasn't able to treat patients other than COVID patients, may all have had a factor. What we've looked to do in the report is to present that data. And again, I think probably similar to Mr. Beattie's question, the ability of us as public auditors to interpret all of that and make those connections between causality of it all is probably something that would be better left to clinicians and indeed the fuller review of the circumstances around COVID at that time. But all of the factors that you mentioned about concern of patients and the extent to which the NHS may have open for services will no doubt want to be considered more fully.
Yeah, and I'm sure you'll monitor this. My concern is that number of excess deaths in these other conditions will go up once we're through the pandemic. So I just think it's something to be monitored. Can I ask you about another area, if I may, and that's NHS boards and their savings targets. And I refer you to Exhibit 7 in your report, where, and indeed, yes, Exhibit 7, which has 2 bar charts, where we can see the number of boards who have achieved targets, some who haven't achieved their targets, and some who are more reliant on non-recurring savings than others. Now, we spoke to NHS Tayside last week, and they were saying in terms of non-recurring savings, they seem to be quite happy where they were, but looking at your chart, there are some boards are doing a lot better than NHS Tayside. There are huge variances in boards that are relying on non-recurring savings. I just wonder, what do you think is a sort of acceptable level, if there is one, in terms of non-recurring savings? that boards should be aiming for?
So, first thing I would say is that I recognise the variation, and which seems quite stark when it's set out in the chart. There will undoubtedly be factors behind this. Some of it will be driven by the need to make savings, and the difference between what the forecast cost of the operating model will be relative to budget will drive some of those numbers. More fundamentally, it will much to do, and I think as you spoke to NHS Tayside about the nature of the operating model and cost base within different health boards, some of which will be providing different services to one another, and we'll have different populations and so forth. So there will be legitimate factors as to why not all boards have the same level of recurring versus non-recurring. I think there's a wider point in terms of the extent to which Scottish Government Health Department has a view on this, and to position about what's that acceptable range to deliver financial balance, allowing for the fact that there undoubtedly will be variation from one year to the next between boards. But I think the point is fair, Mr. Beattie. I think just to have a difference of nearly 70% between NHS Orkney and NHS Ayrshire and Arran does beg the question further. I'll maybe invite Lee Johnson actually just to say if there's anything more. He's looked at this in a bit of detail.
Lee Johnson.
Thank you, Auditor General. I don't have much to add other than, we've seen this consistently over the years, as you know, in terms of recurring savings versus non-recurring savings. But the point is, non-recurring savings are challenging to the ongoing financial sustainability going forward, but they have fluctuated over the years, and boards do increasingly try to increase their recurring savings, but it does fluctuate over the years. But I don't have much more to add.
Okay, I mean, it was just for our guidance, really, going on. The next committee will undoubtedly keep an eye on this, but there are massive variations between. I mean, for example, NHS Ayrshire and Arran, 84% recurring savings. The aforementioned NHS Tayside, 40%, and then we go down to Orkney at 15%. Huge variations. So it's just helpful for the committee to know what kind of figure is acceptable or manageable, I suppose is a better word.
The thing I would add is probably a reference to things Tayside gave you last week, where they benchmarked themselves, if I recall, almost what you would describe as a family group of health boards. For the teaching boards, that they are. Bear in mind that I need to check back as to whether they were referring to these figures, which are to the end of 2019-20, or whether it's more up-to-date figures for the current financial year. But there was a commonality, was their judgment, between themselves and the other teaching boards. And I think that's possibly borne out to some extent, but there'll always be outliers, with the fact that NHS Orkney and NHS Tayside, with similar models, aren't terribly different in their savings. But it's undoubtedly a complex picture, and I think, as even the committee explored with Tayside, how that features with the NRAC funding model and what pressure or demands that puts upon the need for savings. So I think we've looked to report the numbers here. As you know, Mr. Simpson, we've commented many times about the need to move to a sustainable operating model that's less reliant on non-recurring savings. But certainly beyond COVID and the implications of the pandemic, there's that much wider analysis now about what is the stable operating model for the delivery of services that encompasses all aspects of the service.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Okay, Neil Bibby, please.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. The impact of COVID on care homes has been devastating, with over 2,000 people sadly dying. Serious concerns have been raised about discharge policy and also about concerns from trade unions and workers about care homes being unprepared. You've mentioned about the independent review of adult social care in the report, and the report recently published. What is the timescale and scope of Audit Scotland's own work in this area, and what will it cover?
Morning, Mr. Bibby. So we clearly agree with you in terms of the scale of the impact of the pandemic on our care homes and the very tragic deaths that have taken place, and the important need for all of that to be looked at in the round, not just by ourselves but by others, to establish the circumstances to ensure that we avoid that ever happening again. In terms of specifically on our own work around that, we, as you may recall, we'd signalled in our forward work programme and the consultation that we had with yourselves and others that we plan to undertake some further work around the care home sector, particularly about the sustainability of the sector in terms of its financial model and call on public funds. In the meantime, of course, we've seen that the Feely report, the independent review of adult social care, has now been published, and the government's consideration of the recommendations. So it remains in our plan. We're following that very closely about what, if any, future operating model might mean, whether there'll be an introduction of a national care service, and indeed the model that will flow from that, and what implications that has around health and social integration. So with others, we're tracking that very closely. We still plan to do work on care homes and social care more generally towards the end of this year, and we'll continue to engage with the committee as that work.
Thanks for that answer. It's vital. Obviously, lessons are learned in relation to what happened in our care homes, and thank you for that answer. I also want to ask about inequalities, which you talked about in your opening statement, and it's in the report. You mentioned people from deprived backgrounds and ethnic minority backgrounds being harder hit in terms of COVID. The Scottish Government's expert group has raised a need for improved data. This is an issue that's consistently come up, as you're probably aware, in the committee's scrutiny. In your audit work, did you see evidence of data to measure long-term impacts being collected? Was it the right type of data, and was it consistent across bodies? And will you be undertaking future work on the impact of equalities?
So I'll start, and I'll ask Eva to come in as well. She's done much of our work around data. So yes, the impact of the pandemic on inequalities will be a key feature of our work across a range of factors. We've mentioned care homes. Also be reporting next month together with the Accounts Commission on education outcomes, so we'll capture further aspects of the pandemic, children and young people's education. And then similarly, the impact of inequalities will feature really in all of our reporting as we move forward. On the specifics of data, we report at paragraph 34, I think, some of the stark differences of the pandemic. People have said many times that the pandemic hasn't been universally felt, and its impact has been more significantly on the most deprived communities in the country, and quite the stark differences in death rates at paragraph 34 between our most affluent and most deprived. And then we also refer to the disproportionate impact that it's had on our Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities as well. It's important, we make a reference in the report, Mr. Bibby, that the reasons behind this vital to understand better. So again, that as we renew and recover our health and care services, take the necessary steps to avoid this happening in the future. I'll maybe stop, and I'll ask Eva to say a bit more if she wishes on the quality of the data and the extent to which it should.
Thank you. Yeah, we looked at that data that the Auditor General has just mentioned about the deaths in various groups. Other than that, we didn't delve too much into different health inequalities, but we have reported previously on the extent to which health inequalities are wide and have worsened over the last 10 years. It's one of the Auditor General's priorities, so we will definitely be looking into that in more detail in future.
Okay, thank for that answer. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bibby. Final question from me. I think for me the standout element of this report is the pandemic preparedness. This is something that has been raised out with the committee, but Auditor General, it's really quite concerning that it says in paragraph 42 that the Scottish Government had no plan in place to manage this specific kind of outbreak. So its response was informed by the UK Government, I think, pandemic preparedness strategy. And then there were 3 exercises as well, which Scotland was involved in: Exercise Silver Swan, Exercise Cygnus, and Exercise Iris. But it seems that perhaps a lot of the recommendations of these exercises weren't followed up in Scotland. Can you comment a bit further on that, please?
Happy to, Convener. We think there are lessons to be learned in terms of pandemic preparedness. The lessons to be learned in advance of this pandemic, and then the steps that have been taken during the course of this pandemic. What our audit work showed us was that, as we touched on in the report, that there were 3 pandemic preparedness exercises, along with the general framing of that, of the strategy that you mentioned, that had typically been based around a flu pandemic scenario, as opposed to the type of COVID-19 pandemic that's unfolded over the course of the past year. Very specifically, we referenced the fact that not all of the actions and recommendations that arose from those 3 exercises had been implemented by the time the COVID hold, and that quite significantly that 2 of those themes of those exercises, exploring the extent to which our care homes were adequately prepared, and indeed that we would have had sufficient files of PPE and that our health and care workers were fully trained on its usage, both unfolded as we saw so vividly during the course of the pandemic. The wider point that we therefore make is just the importance that all of the recommendations, ensuring that those are still correct and valid, given what we've learned from the course of the pandemic, together with the lessons that we'll now need to learn in the course of the past 12 months, are implemented quickly. Last thing to say, Convener, is that we don't know, of course, whether this is a once-in-a-generation style event or once in 100 years like a Spanish flu, or whether this type of pandemic will be with us on a much more regular basis. So there's a degree of urgency around these steps to take, and particularly thinking about the need for appropriate guidance to our social care settings, that they are better prepared next time round.
I mean, Auditor General, I agree we don't know for sure, but there was plenty of warning. The fact that these exercises were taking place, these preparation exercises, you know, it was widely anticipated that this would happen at some point. I think you're right. The 3 areas of improvement that were recommended were on social care, PPE. Now, I think if you ask anyone in the street, they would say that these were the 2 scandals in Scotland of the pandemic. That's the tragic numbers of deaths in care homes, and the slow response on PPE. The third one, as you say, is about clarify roles and responsibilities, which leads me to conclude it's a bit about leadership, which are themes that this committee has dealt with before. On these 3 recommendations, Auditor General, who would be ultimately responsible in the Scottish Government for receiving these recommendations and making sure that the health boards were dealing with them? Whose desk would these have landed on?
So I'll invite Lee Johnson just to say a bit more about the chronology and responsibilities, how that had happened. But I think that's what we've seen. You recognise the point you make, convener, about roles and responsibilities, particularly the extent to which care homes were sufficiently covered by that. We make reference in the report, for example, the emerging and the role that took place around NHS boards, directors of public health, role that they undertook around care homes during the course of the pandemic, that was a welcome and an important step, but not implemented in advance of the pandemic to give that clinical leadership within the setting that we now see. So I think it's multifaceted about kind of the roles and responsibilities, the importance that that's now much clearer as we come out of the pandemic. But I'll just ask Lee to say a bit more about what that means. Sorry, on you go.
Can I ask you before Lee comes in? I mean, on the point, the recommendations about increase the capacity and capability of social care to cope during an outbreak, do you have the detail of what those recommendations were? Because the reality of the situation is the NHS released patients from hospital, old people, into care homes without being tested. I would be very interested to know if the detail of the recommendations had warned against that in the first place.
We can provide the committee with the information that we have in terms of those 3 exercises, and I'm more than happy to do that. I'm sure the Scottish Government will have that available similarly. In terms of the roles and responsibilities point, I'll maybe just ask Lee to come in, convener. She can explain about what we've seen through the recommendations and the extent to which we know that they've now been implemented.
Lee Johnson.
Thank you, convener. The question about who ultimately is responsible is a difficult one, I think. I think ultimately, as we've seen, the pandemic required a kind of cross-government, inter-agency response. And I think, as we outline in the report as well, the risk of a flu pandemic, despite the fact that it was rated as highly likely to occur and potentially have a severe impact, it wasn't on the corporate risk register, and also was not a standalone risk within the health and social care risk register either. And obviously risks within those risk registers are allocated a director who then has oversight of that risk. But because it wasn't a standalone risk within the risk registers, we feel that there wasn't sufficient oversight. It wasn't, and had it been a standalone risk, I think we would have seen some of the priorities and actions seen through to conclusion. So, for example, the Scottish Government set up the flu short life working group, and one of the priorities for that group was to issue guidance to health and social care. Health and social care did have guidance, but it was guidance for NHS England issued in 2012, and one of the priorities was to update that, and that should have been issued for consultation in March 2018, but wasn't issued for consultation till latterly in 2019. And even when the consultation responses came back, it wasn't updated and it wasn't published. And that guidance would have provided insight into things like access to the PPE stockpile, for example. And I think your other point about what was the detail under the capacity and capability of social care, the documents from the exercises that we talk about, so Silver Swan, Cygnus and Iris, they're fairly high-level documents. They don't go into a lot of detail, but social care capacity does come out in those documents.
And what does it mean by social care capacity? Can you give me more detail on that? Do you mean?
I think it's just about social care being clear about things like, as I've talked about, their access to PPE, about the role that they would have, And obviously within our Scottish context in terms of the roles and responsibilities, for example, of our health and social care partnerships in supporting social care to sustain throughout the pandemic. So it will be wider than care homes. It will be about care at home and other factors.
Okay. Auditor General, I mean, as you know, we'll have the option to potentially take a session with the Scottish Government on this, but on those 3 exercises, do you have the documents that you can release to us, please?
So we've certainly seen the documents, Convener, in terms of making the judgments that we set out in the report, and I've not specifically spoken to the government about any plans to release so I wouldn't imagine there'll be any issue with that, and look to do that with the committee, but we'll just confirm personally with government and then do so.
Okay. Do members have any further issues for Audit Scotland on the NHS 2020 report? Okay, can I thank you, all 4 of you, very much indeed for your evidence this morning. I'm now going to suspend as we close the public section of this meeting and move into private session. Thank you.